Honeycomb is the foundation of the beehive. It is the start of everything for the bees. So it's no surprise that this stuff that the beekeeper puts in their frames that bees build honeycomb off of is called foundation. A lot of beekeepers put foundation in their hives. I've tried both and I always go back to no foundation in my hives. Why on earth would I do this? What is the benefits? And how do you prevent cross comb, a ton of drones, and a big mess in the hive? Well, I'm going to talk about how to set up your hive and your frames if you want to try foundationless beekeeping. Ultimately though, the question for you, the beekeeper, if you want to go foundationless, goes a little bit bigger than do you just like this plastic sheet or not? Is it easier? The question is, how involved do you want to get into the lives of your bees? How much do you want to intervene when it comes to how they set up their home? And how important is convenience over potentially causing more problems with the hive or making it more difficult for the bees to defend themselves and deal with pests so that you have it easier on yourself when checking the bees? Now, we all want to be natural beekeepers. We all don't want to introduce chemicals or pests into the hive, but sometimes there's the question of, are beekeepers doing more harm than good when we intervene? First, I have a toolkit. It's totally free. Download it. You'll also be added onto my newsletter automatically. It has my inspection sheet to guide you while you open up the hive, my recipe for making sugar syrups and pollen patties, an identification guide to help you read frames. The link for that is in the video description. Now, when bees build comb without foundation, the cell sizes will vary a lot. There are people that think that smaller cell sizes are better for the bees to manage varroa mites. There is no real solid proof to verify this. But what I do know is that when cell sizes are smaller, the bees that hatch out of those cells are smaller. And those bees take less time to pupate and hatch faster. And so the shorter the time for the bees to pupate, the shorter the time the varroa mite has to have their babies and reproduce and feed off of that pupa. So there's this twofold thing that beekeepers say. They say that the drone cells, where they take the longest time to pupate, are best because that's where all the varroa mites go. And over 90% of the varroa mites in the hive are hiding with those pupating bees. They want the bigger cell sizes so that they can lay as many eggs as possible. Then we can take them out before that bee hatches and you can freeze it and kill a lot of varroa mites. It's essentially a trap. And the bees will build drone cells. And there is a theory that when they build these drone cells, they are trapping the varroa mites, and it is an easy way to then find the varroa mites and pull out this pupa and kill the varroa mite and the pupa, dispose of it. So when you use no foundation in your hive, the question of, should I put drone comb in my hive? How much drone comb should I put in my hive? Where should I put it in my hive? When should I put it in my hive? Those are not necessary. They are not questions that come up with foundationless beekeeping because the bees answer that question themselves. Are bees making more drone comb when they know that there's a high varroa mite level? We don't know. But the way I figured, why not they know best? And that is the overall reason why I choose to go foundationless. Now, when it comes to foundationless beekeeping in your supers, I did that for the sake of harvesting comb honey. When you have nothing in this frame, you can cut little pieces to put in a jar with honeycomb. You can cut bigger pieces to put in containers to sell to catering companies or to sell at your farmer's market table or what have you. I have also sold frames just totally honeycomb to a resort, and they put it at their breakfast buffet. When you are looking to extract honey, you can also just harvest one frame of honey easily using the crush and strain method. So when you pull out a frame, you can just take a bread knife, cut out the comb, put it into a large flat bottom container, like a large Tupperware container, take your fork and squish it so you're popping all those cells, put it into a bucket strainer and put it over a 5-gallon bucket and let it sit. And then you will have the honey from that frame. It really does not take a long time, and I have a link in a video description where I show you how to do it. It is an easy way to harvest honey without needing any kind of extractor. And if I didn't get an extractor until I had well over 20 hives, because I just harvested comb honey, and for my liquid honey I did it in this manner. I will also say that whenever I put frames with foundation on them, double waxed, plus frames with no foundation, the bees always, very rarely do I ever say always, the bees build honeycomb in their frames with no foundation first. Now, I have read there's a theory that, you see, when there is no foundation in the frame, the bees will eat a lot of nectar to produce wax, and then they festoon, which means that they're forming a chain with their legs, and they will build comb. It's really cute when they're first building it. It's usually like heart shaped, and they build both sides at the same time. But when you have foundation in the frames, they're building one side and then the other. Whether or not this is actually wasting more time or not is not something definite that I can say, but a theory that some people have. Now, when looking for eggs, it is easier when using black foundation, but it's also a lot easier with no foundation, because when you hold a frame up to the sun, you can see right through those cells of honeycomb. And when your hive, it has queen cells in it, and you want to, say, split a bunch of hives and expand your apiary, you can cut those queen cells out. Use a sharp knife and you can cut each of those queen cells out and put them in their own individual split. There are a lot of beekeepers that will warn you against foundationless beekeeping, and I will tell you what some of those problems are. The big one is cross comb. It's when bees build honeycomb in all different patterns and directions, and they will connect it to each other, the frame next to it, or the sides of the box. There is also, when you harvest honey and you're putting in extractor, there is the possibility for a blowout, which is when the honeycomb just totally flops out of the frame and it's a big clump inside your extractor. Now, it's not like the end of the world, because you're going to have that big spout and that goes into a strainer, so you're not ruining your honey, but you are going to have to pull it out and put it in a container and squish it and then put it onto your strainer. But also, you're going to have honeycomb that's not going to be perfectly straight like it is on your plastic sheets. So when you're pulling your frame out of the beehive, it's not going to be totally straight like this. It's going to be a little bit wavy. And the frame next to it's also going to be a little bit wavy. So when you pull the frame out, you want to check it. If it's the first frame in your box, maybe you're going to put it alongside the hive, and then you're going to pull the other frames out. But when you put your frames back in, you want to make sure you put them in the same order and the same way that they were. You don't want to be flipping it around, because you could be messing up the bee space. You could be now causing that honeycomb to be squished up against the frame next to it, and now the bees can't access it. I will say that foundationless beekeeping is not easier. You are going to have to be more aware of what you do when you pull out a frame, and make sure that you do the same thing with every frame every time. Another downside to doing comb honey is that the beeswax is very porous and it will absorb the scent of your smoker. So you want to go easy on the smoke when checking on any frames that you potentially are going to be harvesting for comb honey. And if you think that you are going to have a time during this beekeeping year that you're not going to be able to check your bees at least every other week, then you want to hold off on the foundationless beekeeping, because if there is a time when your comb goes a little bit off the frame, you're going to want to fix it. So let's get into how we do this. If you are still on board with trying some foundationless beekeeping, you do not have to go all in. You can just do one frame literally and see how it goes. One frame in any of the boxes of your hive. Now, first we have the hive. You want your hive to be level. Totally level. If you live in an area that gets really rainy and you have experienced water on your solid bottom board, this doesn't pertain to people with screened bottoms, but if you have a solid bottom and you get water coming into your hive, then you can lift up the back of your hive like a ½ inch max. Just, maybe 4 or 5 degrees so that water runs in. But that is it. The rest of the hive should be totally level. If you are in a really hilly area, I had bees that were not on my property, and so I couldn't level out the area. I had my bees on pallets because I could level out the feet of the pallet just by putting pieces of wood under there, and that was sufficient for my bees. The other thing you want to do is make sure you're observing bee space. So you put 10 frames in a 10 frame box, 8 frames in an 8 frame box. Once your comb is all drawn out and your box is 90% full, you could take that 10th frame out, that's okay. But while they are drawing out the comb, you want there to be bee space, which is 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. That is what Langstroth figured out and how he created the movable frame hive. Without the bee space, you know, if you put your bees in a big empty basket, they're going to build comb all over the place. On a side note, I worked for a farm that the owner was a sculptor, and he would put sculptures made of wax, heads mostly. He had like a whole shelf of beeswax heads. He would put them in a beehive with no frames, and he would put a plexiglass window on the side, and the bees would blow comb off of the sculptures. He has shown artwork in the Guggenheim, museums all over the world, still makes artwork, still has showings. What I loved about that was you can really see what bees will do in an empty space like that. He then would take it out of the hive, leave it out for the ants and stuff to clean up so that there wasn't honey or anything in there that could go bad. And then he would freeze it and put this glass box over it and sell it for tens of thousands of dollars. But the tricky part is the frames. You need to set up the frames so that bees aren't building comb in weird directions. In addition to the hive being level, I recommend putting a starter strip in the hive. Your starter strip can be popsicle sticks put in the groove of the top bar, and then you can drizzle some beeswax over it to keep it in place. Or you can take sheets of beeswax, cut it up into 1-inch thick strips and put them in there. You can drizzle some beeswax to hold it in, or take a popsicle stick to keep it in place. In addition to having your frames with your starter strips, it really helps to checkerboard. And that's because when bees build comb, they don't build in any direction on each frame. They will usually start a pattern and then continue with that pattern, just varying ever so slightly frame to frame. So if you have a frame that the bees are starting to build in the direction off of the frame, and you want to stop that, if you have a frame like this, it's going to stop this problem right here. You can checkerboard with frames of just waxed foundation, but the best way to checkerboard is with frames with comb already drawn out. Now, if you're putting on an empty honey super onto your beehive and you want to harvest some comb honey, then if you have any frames of drawn out comb or honey, put a couple in here with the checkerboarding. So we'll have the wall of our beehive, and we'll put in an empty frame with your starter strip in here. Let's say we'll do 2 empty frames. Then you'll take a frame of honey, drawn out comb, or at the very least some foundation, and then we'll do 2, or if you want to go crazy, do 3 empty frames with just a starter strip, and then we'll do another frame of either just plain plastic foundation, but best would be if you had drawn out comb or comb with some honey in it. At max, going 2 or 3 frames with no foundation. So if you're adding a second brood box onto your hive, then what you can do is take 2 frames of brood from your lower box and put them in this upper box. So we're just going to say these 2 frames have brood on them. We're going to put them right in the middle. Then we're going to put an empty frame with no drawn out comb on either side of that brood. And then we're going to put either a frame of foundation or drawn out comb, comb with honey in it, next to those empty frames, and then another 2 empty frames on either side. So we have checkerboard again. We have 2 empty frames, a frame with comb, an empty frame, 2 frames of brood, an empty frame, a frame with drawn out comb or foundation, 2 more empty frames. And what this does is it gives you some foundationless frames to try. It also brings brood up to this empty box, which will help encourage the bees to move up here sooner. It checkerboards your brood so that the bees are going to want to close up these gaps. And then as your bees start to put more and more brood in, you could continue to take empty frames and put them in between 2 frames of brood to continue to checkerboard. So the bees they don't like those gaps between the brood. They will draw out the comb and fill up those empty frames in their brood nest. But then there's what I do. So this is what I do. I just put my frames, no starter strip, in my hives. I just checkerboard. Now I have a 12 cubic foot freezer, so when I have comb that's drawn out, when I have excess honey, I always have some in my freezer. And the reason why is that when I put an empty super or an empty brood box on my hive, it is always checkerboarded with, at the very least, drawn out comb. And having that honeycomb in that straight line, plus having my hives level and that bee space, I have found is enough for me. But for you, when getting started, you might want to do the starter strip. Since I have been doing comb honey for so many years, when I cut the comb out, there's that little bit of beeswax residue all along the edge of the frame from where the comb was. So when I put this back in the hive, always put it in the freezer first. When I put it back in the hive, I don't scrape the wax off, I don't torch it. And I have read studies that say that all those nosema spores and other things that people are concerned is going to get put into your hive don't live long enough for it to be a problem, and you don't need to torch and clean these things. So I don't do any of that stuff. I leave that beeswax residue from when there was comb in the frame. I just freeze it to make sure that the wax moth and stuff are killed, and then I put it back in the hive, and so there already is a starter strip. So once you've had frames that you've harvested comb from, you have your starter strip already there, and you don't have to put another one in. If you want to learn from start to advanced how to keep bees, check out my online beekeeping course at Beekeeping Made Simple. It includes mentorship, so that because I found that to be the hardest part, is figuring out what works for my unique situation. So you have me to email and talk to about your bees so that we can help you keep happy, healthy bees. Okay, real fast, here's the story. I got started beekeeping. First 2 years of beekeeping, I had top bar hives. So I had no foundation, I really just had those bars in the very typical top bar hive. And I experienced cross comb, I experienced the bees building comb off the sides of the hive, and I mean, I didn't check a good portion of the hive the whole summer because I was afraid to take the comb off, and I had comb fall off the bars. So when I went to Hawaii and worked for a commercial apiary with Langstroth style hives, and all of their frames had either plastic beeswax coated foundation or wire in their frames, I was like, oh my God, this is so much easier. I love Langstroth style beehives. I never want another top bar hive again. I'm not saying top bar hives are bad, but this was just my preference. I loved the security of having my comb within this frame. And for those of you who love this too, but don't want to do the heavy lifting, that long Langstroth hive, I think is a much better choice than the typical top bar hive. But being in Hawaii and getting paid a terrible salary, I think they started me at $10 an hour, and the high cost of living and rent in Hawaii, I was living in a studio for $700 a month, and it literally had a hot pot and a mini fridge. It used to be the queen breeding shack for a queen breeding apiary. So I made all of my own boxes, lids, bottom boards. Only thing I bought was a box of 100 frames from Amazon. I did not buy foundation. One person had a bunch of frames that were plastic with the plastic foundation attached to it, and he had boxes and boxes. I think I got at least 50 frames from this guy, maybe 100, and that's what I used. I hated them. They were cracking, they were old. I hated the small hive beetles getting stuck in those plastic frames and all of the cracks and stuff around them. And so I also was in the process of using no foundation in my honey supers. And this was because I wanted to start my own hives, but I didn't know how I was going to make money off of it and pay for all of this equipment and the investment I was making, because there was tons of people selling honey in Hawaii. The natural food store had a whole shelf, like it was a good 4 feet tall, rows and rows of different people selling honey. But the company I worked for was a beekeeping operation and a honey packing company. And the woman that ran the honey packing company said, I cannot find anyone to sell me comb honey. My husband doesn't want to do it, nobody else does it, but I have lots of people asking for it. So that's when I started comb honey. And for comb honey, the cheapest way to do comb honey is to put foundationless frames in your hive. So I taught myself how to do that without causing big problems, because I did have up to 25 hives that I was managing all by myself, so that I could do comb honey without spending $4 per container for those round comb containers. Because keep in mind, this is Hawaii, so expensive is shipping, and that's how I got started. And since I hated all of that plastic foundation that person had given me, I started to make my way to putting no foundationless frames in my brood boxes as well. The reason why I continue to not use foundation in my hives, despite the fact that I am now making over $10 an hour, and I have foundation that it's sitting around, I don't use it, is for a few reasons. But the big one is that I don't like to tell the bees what to do. I've already put them in the style box and in these frames and low to the ground, which is against what honeybee colonies would do in the wild, because it is convenient for me. Now, although putting foundation in your frames does make it more convenient for the beekeeper, it is the time that I just put my foot down and I say, okay, let them do what they want to do, because this is the foundation of the hive. Before I end this video, I just wanted to mention these two guys. There are people that want foundation but don't want it to be plastic, so they will use beeswax foundation, and there are people that will put wire in their frames. The beeswax foundation, I don't see a huge benefit, because this isn't going to keep your frames from having a blowout in the extractor. It still can get a little wavy, and so you still want to be careful putting it in and out. The only benefit, bees have to build this cell size, the only benefit that I am aware of to the beeswax foundation is that you are preventing cross comb, and you're preventing your bees from building drone comb. Now, I am a huge advocate of letting the bees make as many drones as they want to. I sell my honey, but you know what? That's not what I'm doing this for. I'm not doing it for the sake of like getting as much honey as possible. So if they want to make a lot of drones, then I think they have a reason to, and I'm going to let them. You can, though, take wire and put some horizontal strips in here, and that will help keep it a little bit more straight, so that your frame isn't as wavy. Now, another thing you can do if you don't like the starter strips is you can put wire in your frames. You see, this frame has these little holes on the side, and you can buy frames that have these holes on them. And this wire is from Beekeeping supply site, but this is, 26 to 28 gauge wire, and you thread this through your frames. I have a link to a great video where someone shows you very easily how to thread your frames, and this will give your comb that support when putting in an extractor. It can still potentially, you can have a blowout too, but it does give it that extra little bit support. You can still harvest comb honey. Now, you can harvest comb honey with certain kinds of beeswax foundation, but that kind of grosses me out, eating comb honey with even the thinnest little bit of edible beeswax foundation. That stuff smells weird. So with the wire foundation, you can't harvest like big pieces of comb, but you can harvest little pieces to put into jars. I've seen this in the brood boxes of the commercial apiary I worked for, so it allows the bees to build whatever cell sizes they want, but just gives them a little bit more support and gives them a little bit of direction. So that is why I'm a foundationless beekeeper, and how I set up my hives for foundationless beekeeping. Please add in other benefits that you can think of or that you have found to be the case in your hives when using wire in your frames, beeswax foundation, or plastic beeswax coated foundation. I would love to have a great conversation going about the pros and cons of this style of beekeeping. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my video about how to read a frame in your hive, because after all, honeycomb and the frames are the foundation of the beehive, and my top rookie mistakes that I have made and that I want to help prevent you from making when becoming a beekeeper.